Welcome to Talking Tudors, Georgie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, thank you for being here. I'm really excited. So let's start with an introduction. Would you mind just saying hello to all our listeners and viewers and just telling us a little bit about you and the work you do?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. So I'm Georgie. I'm currently a second year PhD student at the University of Kent in the Centre for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. My project is kindly funded by the Consortium for the Humanities and Arts Southeast and Stuart Hall Foundation. So it's a blessing really for PhD
Yeah.
study. I did my BA and MA in film studies, so it's quite a wild departure. To medieval studies, but sort of during that sort of brief stint, sort of 5 years, 4 or 5 years, I think, I looked at film as history and also film as a vehicle for sort of the transmission of history. So there's some crossover there. And my project is mainly medieval sort of literature and codicology. So it's a sort of fusion of the two. And I look at race in Shavaric romances from North Atlantic Europe.
So let's talk a little bit more about your work on race and race making in the medieval world and what inspired you to actually pursue this line of research.
Well, I guess I've always been sort of interested in it as someone who's so I'm like mixed. So I'm black, white, British. So I've always been really interested in sort of my history, but you really see that sort of beginning with the transatlantic slave trade. That's I think when most people assume that people of color, especially black people, were sort of had a presence in Europe.
Mhm.
And then I sort of read Black Tudors. Um, and I was like, whoa, this is amazing. I always had like a sense that our history went back further. But there was this book that was just so rich and vivid. And because I was doing film studies, I did look a lot of sort of black cinema and things like that. But when I sort of was thinking about my proposal, at first it did have some things with film. So it was looking at mainly Arthurian retellings in cinema, but also looking at the response to those. So there's a lot of films that had people of color in them and sort of in this Arthurian setting. And you had a lot of backlash, people saying this is like totally sort of
Yeah.
unfounded. And sort of then in the recent years, you've had TV shows like House of the Dragon, so the Game of Thrones spin-off, and then you had The Rings of Power. And again, these are fantasy shows with that sort of kind of pseudo medieval sort of historical setting, and you have people of color in them. And people take the most umbrage with the fact that there are black people in a fantasy show, and they're like, oh, that's not realistic. But there are things like dragons
Yeah,
and all
exactly.
these sort of totally fantastical elements. I'm like, I'm really sorry, but black people exist. We
Yeah.
are real. I hate to break it to you. And then I met with my supervisors. We had a really good chat, and then we sort of actually maybe have sort of that popular culture element in sort of my first sort of opening sort of methodology, but then it really shifted to looking at the romances because I'd done a lot of work and mainly on Arthurian stuff and sort of started to find actually there are characters who are people of color. So there are black people and there are people that we would now know as people from the Middle East. And so I sort of really started digging and tracing these romances to see if I could find more, and it sort of spiraled from there, and I'm really happy that it has.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing work. And so let's dive into that aspect of your work a little bit more. So, how
Mm.
is race approached in some of these chivalric texts that you've been examining and studying? And how do these representations actually challenge our modern conceptions?
I think first and foremost, they make us realize that wait, the Middle Ages sort of. I think I'm sort of speaking within that European sense of the Middle Ages because I think now that we're sort of moving, that's a global Middle Ages, and when we think of the medieval, it's always almost always European in nature, and it sort of excludes the rest of the world. But I'm sort of looking within that sort of European world. I think first and foremost, when you look at these texts, I think my earliest is 12th century. I think I could go back a little earlier, but there's not enough sort of time or scope in a PhD to do too much. But you sort of look from these really early texts, and there are instances where sort of characters are meeting people of color, or specifically for me, so my core corpus of texts, the characters that I'm looking at, they have to be narrative agents. So they have to be doing something in the
Mhm.
narrative. They can't just be floating around in the background, which quite often happens. but it sort of challenges that notion that the European Middle Ages was sort of racially sort of homogenous.
Mhm.
It's mainly white, and that's it. Um, and then it starts to unpick so many myths that medieval people travelled. They didn't just stay stationary. They saw the world if you had the means. I mean, pilgrimage. If you
Mhm.
had the means to go on pilgrimage, you would. That was a huge thing, and that meant usually if you're not doing sort of a pilgrimage, maybe to Santiago de Compostela,
Mhm.
or even if you went to Spain, you're going to meet sort of people,
Yeah.
a huge variety of people, considering the history of Spain. But even if you went to the Holy Land, which was like, the top sort of pilgrimage spot, you're going to meet so many different people, and the way that you see the world is going to change. But again, yeah, the main thing is there were people of color in that period, and I think the way that I look at it is this literature and this sort of cultural vehicle is almost being used as a way to sort of understand difference. So that's what I'm looking at. But chivalric romances, I think, because I love them, I think that they're fantastic. Arthurian literature is brilliant. There's so much going on, and it's because they're so popular. I think it made it the perfect vehicle for me to start looking at race, because the way in which we understand race in the medieval period is a whole kettle of fish in itself.
Yes, absolutely. So is that the main reason why you sort of chose the chivalric and romance text?
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously you enjoy them, but also because of their huge
Yes.
popularity?
Yeah, so essentially these were sort of the modern popular culture of the day, right? So
Yeah,
these
yeah.
are huge like entertainment vehicles, especially the Arthurian corpus. It sort of starts, it's so contested where this starts. It sort of probably has roots within the Celtic tradition, so mainly Wales, but the Arthurian literature that we know and the sort of ideas that we have started mainly sort of in France. And then you have sort of spread outwards, and there's all sorts of different traditions. You have sort of the Arthur of the French, you have Arthur of the English, and then you have Arthur of the Germans and even Arthur of the Low Countries. He then makes it to Spain and Italy. And I think there are also some Arthurian texts in the Scandinavian tradition as well. And they all sort of interlink with each other, but some of them are their own complete creation. So they've got hold of Arthur from maybe some of the older French texts and decided they actually don't like what the French are doing, and then completely sort of changing that. But because they reach so many people, so part of my research, I look at the texts, but then I also look at sort of reception to these
Mhm.
texts by cataloguing all the extant manuscripts of my corpus. And by doing so, I can ascertain sort of the spread, but
Yeah.
what kind of people are asking for these texts to be written down. So, if something's gone into a manuscript in particular, it's because someone has requested for this text to be, made into sort of book form. A lot of romance texts are very ephemeral in nature. So you'll have manuscripts, right? So
Mhm.
romance manuscripts, very rarely do you have a romance where it's just one in a manuscript. Sometimes you have very small ones, but a lot of them are sort of they're over in miscellanies, so they're with other related texts. So there's a bunch which are sort of religious miscellanies. So you have some religious texts, and you
Mhm.
have romances which are religious in nature, and they'll have been put together. You'll sometimes have sort of compilations of romances. So one of my core texts is Morian, which is a Dutch text, and that's now in the what's now known as the Lancelot compilation. That's in The Hague, and that's, as it says on the tin, it's a whole bunch of Middle Dutch romances which all have Lancelot in them. So someone was obviously very interested in those.
Yeah.
But there's some texts which we think were actually sort of distributed not only orally, but they were in little pamphlets. So they were sort of what we would call a single quire manuscript. So they would have been shortened to fit onto sort of a little booklet,
Mhm.
basically, and it was cheap. So people that weren't of sort of high mercantile standing or sort of gentry or aristocracy could still get hold of these manuscripts. And I haven't found any yet in the sort of English tradition, but there are
Yeah.
some in the Low Countries. There are actually some surviving examples, and we can look at those in conjunction with the texts that survive in the manuscript, and you can see they've actually shortened so they can fit into these booklets. But essentially, what it tells us is these are circulating on all sort of forms of the social strata. So it's great to get a sense of
Yeah,
who
absolutely.
is reacting to these texts.
And so, in what other ways then are ideas about race disseminated and digested in the medieval world? Are there other ways apart from the sort of printed text and
Mm.
booklets?
Yeah, so I think whenever I start talking about sort of my project, a lot of people think, oh, you're looking at sort of archaeological evidence, because I think that's what most people want to cling to, is they sort of understand that if we have, archaeological evidence, say, sort of the ivory bangle lady, she's Roman, but they
Right.
did sort of DNA testing on ivory bangle lady, and I think she was found in London. She's now in the Yorkshire Museum, and you can go and see her. And they have a whole bunch of sort of stuff. It's a fantastic exhibition. But they did DNA testing, and so they found that she's probably from, I think, sort of North Africa, so that huge
Right.
region. And sort of that's like a concrete example.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that there were people that weren't white in sort of Roman Britain in the past, and people are like, okay, right, even some people can test that, but that's a nice sort of tangible thing to hold on to. In the medieval period, we don't really have a lot of sort of archaeological evidence. It's really scant. There is a post-Roman sort of really early medieval British grave, and she's called Eastery Girl, and she's really local to where I am. So I'm in Canterbury in Kent, and Eastery is really close. It's, I think, maybe like 30 minutes away. I could be, in my brain it's about 30 minutes away,
Yeah.
but it's very close. And she was sort of buried in a grave which was sort of within the bounds of that community. They did some DNA testing and they found that her ancestry is from West Africa, so not North Africa, which most people assume, but she's from West Africa. And again, it's another example that
Yeah.
people that looked different and or had different sort of lineage were accepted into communities pre, the transatlantic slave trade, essentially, because that's when most people assume that people of color started coming into Europe. I think for me, I'm looking at sort of more cultural things. So I'm obviously looking at literature, but there is art. It's art. People of color abound in art, and it's again complicated because you see so many different depictions. So there'll be a lot of depictions of people of color as being demons or sinful. And again, this is a really complex thing because it's going with sort of a theological understanding of the role color plays. So you have that sort of idea that white is, it's angelic, it's pure, and then obviously its antithesis is black. So you'll see a lot of that, which to us is really confusing because to our modern conception of race, that's extremely damning because it's following the line that black people are seen as lesser than, or people of color are seen as lesser than white, but it's not really the case in the medieval period. There's a lot more to it.
Mm.
But then you'll also get examples of black knights. So you'll see blackness as within that Christian sphere is venerated. So Saint Maurice is a saint, and he was a sort of, I think, Roman, but in the beginning of his sort of veneration, he was actually shown as white. But in the sort of 13th century, you had some German emperors, the Hohenstaufens, and they had some land in Sicily, and they saw sort of black soldiers, and they sort of had this idea that, oh, these people are Christian, and we can bring people we thought weren't necessarily the same as us and had the same sort of outlook. We can bring them into sort of our view, show the power of Christianity and sort of the power of our empire. There's always some ulterior motive,
Yeah.
but Saint Maurice, from a we know from earliest is sort of the evidence that we have, which is sort of 13th century, he is portrayed as black. So you can, if people Google St. Maurice Magdeburg, it's the sort of earliest depiction we have of St. Maurice as black. And he is a knight, and he's been depicted as that way sort of mostly sort of ever since, especially in sort of this Rhineland region, that's sort of the west of Germany. But St. Maurice's symbol is the black eagle that you see in German iconography
Oh,
today.
right.
And a lot of people don't realize that's related
No.
to a black saint and not sort of someone you would assume to be white. But there's so many things. But for my project, because we're sort of trying to nuance the way we understand race and sort of not cherry pick as much, I've decided to look at
Mm.
literature. But obviously, I'm have the whole sort of methodological section and sort of literature review, which does take into account a lot of this sort of really wide range of examples that we have.
And Georgie, I know that you recently gave a paper at the Leeds International Medieval Congress,
Mm-hmm.
very exciting, about how Romance
Yes.
manuscripts aid our understanding of the presence of people of colour in North Atlantic Europe. So tell us a little bit about the case study that you presented there.
Yeah, so I thought I'd do something sort of methodological just to showcase why I'm choosing to do sort of a literary analysis and then also use sort of manuscripts. So, in a lot of current discourses on race, people either cherry pick examples. So, they'll use examples from literature, from art, maybe some sort of archaeological sort of evidence, things from sort of more documentary sources, so from sort of chancery rolls, all that kind of stuff. And what that does, it's great, but and it shows the sort of diversity and a range of sort of sources we have, but it really skews sort of the way we look at race as being a universal. So in the medieval period, it's hard to explain because I think we have an idea of race, particularly because of the transatlantic slave trade. It's very much tied with skin color. It's very much tied
Yeah.
with sort of a biological referent, and for us that is skin color. But if you go back to a period where the ideas and sort of the ideologies which facilitated the transatlantic slave trade in sort of the later part of the medieval period, especially in sort of Spain, Portugal, and Italy, you have the seeds of what will become the transatlantic slave trade. They started the trade in sort of Black Africans very early, much earlier than in sort of that northern stretch, so in for England. But it's still not it's not the same. So, when we go into the transatlantic slave trade, we have the ideas which are sort of tied with modernity, that sort of imperial
Mhm.
sort of outlook, that colonial outlook, and that really changes the way people interact with others. But in the period that I'm looking at, you have the seeds there, but you don't have what it becomes. So
Yeah.
race is a completely sort of different idea. So to sort of really get to the crux of what's going on, looking at terms that should be used, I've nuanced what I'm looking at. So I'm only looking at North Atlantic Europe, and I see that as sort of England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. I haven't included Scandinavia because it's its own entity. It's
Yeah.
culturally, it's very different to sort of this section I'm looking at. And I've excluded Portugal, Spain, and Italy because, again, that southern Mediterranean
Mm.
stretch of Europe goes through vastly different cultural contexts than what, say England does, for example. We're very much on the fringe of
Mhm.
this cultural hub which is going on in sort of that Mediterranean space, especially in the Middle Ages. So essentially my paper at Leeds was saying, this is why I'm looking at literature and manuscripts. So I used the example of Morian, which is a 13th century sort of Middle Dutch text. It's Arthurian in nature, and if people can guess from his name Morian, the Moor, he's a
Mhm.
black knight. And this is a sort of one of the most, I think, amazing examples that I found. So essentially the story for Morian, he leaves his home. His mum had him. She had sort of a relationship with an Arthurian knight. He promised her that he'd come back. He never does. He breaks his promise, leaves his mother landless because of the relationship
Mhm.
and leaves her in shame. So Morian says, look, when I'm old enough, I'm going to go out, I'm going to go find my dad, bring him back, restore sort of you to the sort of proper station that you should have. So he goes out from Morian, which is again, they're not very inventive with names, but it gets the job done. He goes out into sort of this Arthurian space, looking for his father. He meets Gawain and Lancelot, so the two big sort of stalwarts of Arthurian sort of tradition, especially within sort of the space that I'm looking at. They're on their own sort of mission. They're looking for Percival. So this romance is within a bigger tradition of sort of Percival romances. It's within this sort of Grail tradition. He's gone and done something. They're like, oh, he's missing. We're going to go and look for him. They meet Morian. Long story short, they have a few exchanges. At first, they think Morian is sort of a devil because he's dressed in all black. They can't see his face, but the association there, you have that sort of theological association. They're like, oh, this man is a devil. He's giant. He's in all black. I don't know what's going on here. Morian ends up exclaiming to God, and so they're then like, okay, something's going on here. This man is Christian. He can't be a devil. Lancelot does his sort of classic Lancelot thing. He starts having a fight with Morian. They both challenge each other. So they're having a little scrap. And Gawain is there on the sideline, sort of waiting to see if he needs to help his fellow knight Lancelot, and he has existential sort of crisis. He's talking about Morian. He's like, wow, this guy is really tall. He's got a great horse. He's decked out to the nines. He's a great fighter, so Morian can match Lancelot bar for bar, essentially, for want of a better term. They're equally matched,
Mm-hmm.
and this is great because Lancelot is the paragon of chivalry. So we're seeing there's something about Morian that sort of puts him in sort of this higher status, and so it goes through all these things, and sort of at the end the Dutch translates to so what that he's black. So we have this whole interaction where at the end Morian does take his helmet off, and the Dutch author really goes in with these sort of metaphors, saying he's sort of as black as burnt coal, he's as black as a raven. He uses what we would see as a very racist stereotype of that difference between really white teeth and really dark skin. But again, it's playing with this idea of coloured contrast, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to get the audience to have a reaction to this character, because it's something that you don't see very often in romances, and especially you don't see knights or sort of people who aren't antagonists in this role. So a lot of the time you'll have this sort of overtly almost what we would see as sort of racist depictions, but it's always for people who are the enemy. So for this text, it's doing something completely different. But you have this, they're saying, hold on a minute, something's going on. This man, when they see his face, they're like, wow, he's really handsome, he's great. So what that he's black, he has all of these qualities that we see and expect from knights. The only thing that is different is his skin color, but that's totally sort of superfluous. So what they've done is before they see his face, they are like, oh, this man's a good knight. Okay, we can give him brotherhood. They offer him friendship and
Mm-hmm.
sort of and help because he tells them about his quest. So they make an assumption and their assessment not based on the fact of the way he looks. They only
Yeah.
see that afterwards. And the key thing with this text, and it's really interesting for me because I'm looking at people's reactions
Hmm.
to skin color and to difference, is that these people are from a higher social class. So it's generally within romance, you have sort of nobility is able to recognize nobility even when they don't
Mm-hmm.
know it.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have there's Talon and Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, one of the most famous sort of Arthurian romances of Sir Gareth. He goes in as sort of a fair unknown, and he sees Kay, who's the seneschal, and Kay is always the kind of stupid, a bit dumb character. He sees Gareth, and he sends him to the kitchen, and he looks at his hands, and he's like, "Oh, you have really fair hands for working in a kitchen." Sort of, but he can't recognize the fact
Mm.
he has fair hands is because he's noble, but Kay isn't noble, so he can't recognize that. But when you take that idea and you put it on Morian, Gawain and Lancelot are both noble, and Morian,
Uh-huh.
by sort of his lineage, because he's the son of Arthurian knight, he is noble. They can recognize this. But later on in the romance, Morian is off looking for his father. He's parted ways with Gawain and Lancelot. They're off doing their own thing. He comes to a ferry crossing and he wants to sort of cross the water. The people see him, and unlike sort of Lancelot and Gawain, they see his face from the beginning. They see his black, and they're like, "Oh!" They literally think he is the devil come to Earth. So they take their boats and they leave. They don't talk to him. They don't engage with him. They don't give him sort of the time of day. And what the author is cleverly doing is it's a suggestion that people from a certain social standing
Mm.
are more likely to be accepting or to understand difference than those from a lower social standing,
Right. Yeah.
because they don't have the worldliness or the education that sort of people from a different social class would have. So it's a really interesting idea on the intersectionalities of race. So with Fomorian, he's obviously his skin color is a huge thing, but this is sort of mitigated by sort of several factors. So it's mitigated by the fact he's a knight, he's of a higher social class. He's Christian, that's a huge thing because they're like, okay, you're not the real enemy, you're not, non-Christian, and he's a man. So these things are sort of mitigated. So this is a great. So I was sort of within this paper talking about, when we look at race, it's very intersectional in this period. It still is now, but we mainly focus on sort of skin color. Within this period, it's very much intersectional. There's certain factors that if you hit that, they can sort of then bring you in to sort of a community. But in terms of the manuscript, it survives now that only survives fully in one manuscript. So it's fragmentary, it's very early Flemish, and that now survives it's in Brussels, in the Royal Library in Brussels. So the text is Flemish in origin, but it survives in full in a Middle Dutch adaptation translation, which is now in the Lancelot compilation in The Hague. And this is a real treasure of Dutch Arthuriana. So the manuscript itself has, I think, about 10 sort of romances. 3 of them are Dutch translations of the Grail cycle, so sort of from the French tradition. So they've then taken that and they've adapted it. And then there's 7 more original Middle Dutch romances. But the important thing, what I was looking at is, so when I go in and look at these manuscripts, I really look at sort of the material quality of them. And there's so many things here. The manuscript, if anyone interested in it, is fully digitized. So you
Oh,
can,
that's great.
yeah, it's on the Hague. It's luckily most Dutch manuscripts, they have a really good process of digitization. So it's fully digital. They've done a really great thing where you can click on and you can see the text. It's in Middle Dutch, but I'm sure you can sort of copy and translate it. But you can really sort of get in close to the manuscript and sort of get a sense of what I'm talking about. But it's a normal size sort of in nature. It's about 28 by 19, I think. So it's a
Okay.
sort of just smaller than like a hardback book,
Mhm.
just around sort of that size. But it's the quality of the parchment is wanting. So it's not great quality parchment. A lot of it has holes. So where the parchment was prepared, it's been stretched and there are holes which have then been repaired. There are some holes which are really small, which aren't worth repairing, that have been written around. Some of the parchment is palimpsest, so it's been written on before, and they've then scraped that off and they've reused it. So what that tells me is this is like very utilitarian in nature. It's not a presentation
No,
copy.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not someone's finest china. When people think of medieval manuscripts, it's always those really richly illuminated ones that come to mind with sort of that crisp white parchment. This is very much, it's not that. It's very sort of a bit scruffy, I think we would call it. It's a very beat up book. There are other sort of things which point to what this might be used for. So there are lots of sort of scribal corrections. So there are 5 hands in this book. So essentially 5 people worked on this. But there is a 6th, which is not part of that scribal group.
Mhm.
And this is what is known as the corrector. So this is someone else who's gone in and they've corrected scribal mistakes. So where the scribes have perhaps missed a line, they've gone in and they've re-added it. Sometimes the scribes have made spelling errors. They've gone in and corrected those. And occasionally they've left the dialect as Flemish. This was made in Brabant, which is sort of really close to that Flemish region. And they would have been able to understand each other. So you would have Brabantine Dutch and you would have Flemish. They're very similar, but they did not like each other. So they would argue that if I'm looking at something in Flemish and in Brabant, I would want someone to change that into sort of a Brabantine
Mhm.
version and sort of vice versa. It's because the Flemish thought they were better than sort of anyone else in that region because they were very rich at one period in time. So they were like, we're clearly better than these other people. And so the people in Brabant were like, oh, we don't want to associate with the Flemish. So they've gone through and sort of changed things like that. But sort of the most important for me, and this is just one sort of theory, people aren't really clear on why this person has gone in and done this, but they have added little things which point to sort of an oral performance of the text. Middle Dutch is an extremely contextual language. So what that means is you'll have a subject, and so you'll mention a subject maybe once and you won't mention the subject again. You have either a demonstrative pronoun or you won't have that at all. It's because what they're doing is they're like, you're still following on, this is
Mhm.
the subject. So it drops sort of a lot. So sometimes it will drop. Demonstrative pronouns are great and sort of pronominal indications. So like he, she, it, they, sometimes they don't have that.
Oh,
You
right.
don't need it, which is very frustrating when you're sometimes trying to translate things because you keep having to go back to make sure that the subject you think you're talking
It's
about
still the right one.
the it's still the right subject. So what this person has done is they've gone back in and they've added pronominal indications. They've
Ah,
added some demonstrative pronouns. They've also added in and. So it's all in verse, it's not in prose, but they've gone in and added and. So people are, because the enjambment, especially with the contextual language, can be really confusing. So they've gone in so people can know that this is still connecting. We're still on sort of that same sort of idea. So what that suggests in sort of one of many ideas that people are coming out with is that this is prepared to be spoken orally. So it's not only a hand for the person who's performing the text, it's good for people listening, because when you're listening to an extremely contextual language, you need as many pointers as you
mm,
possibly can, especially if you're listening to a poem or a piece of text which is sort of tens or 20 of thousands of lines long. You're going to need little pointers to keep you in the game, essentially. So looking at that, using sort of the utilitarian sort of presentation of this book, you can sort of suggest that whilst the texts are prepared and sort of have notions of aristocracy, perhaps, or even sort of upper mercantile. This book certainly wasn't produced for anyone in that region. It's probably produced for someone who is going to be within those circles, but they're going to be performing, they're not actually within it. So you can sort of make all these connections. And that's essentially what I was doing with this paper, is saying, here is Morian, here is how it challenges our conceptions of race. This is how then Morian is transmitted or
mhm.
disseminated to certain social groups. And then you can see that through the sort of comparisons between the reaction of people from a higher social group to those from a lower social group. You then take that information, look at the manuscript, essentially saying that likely this is being shared within, I'm unsure if it would be within sort of aristocracy, but in sort of the Low Countries, especially within the sort of later period, you had these places called chambers of rhetoric, which you would have people from mercantile, maybe a little bit lower social standing. They would go in and it's basically a space where people would learn about different literatures and cultures. It was a form of education. Essentially, one of the many things that I'm sort of having to think about is, can we sort of think about early forms of chambers of rhetoric, because things just don't come out of nowhere. These things are cultivated, right? So perhaps these texts were maybe presented in communal spaces,
Mm.
as well as being maybe in sort of more private spaces for someone who was reading for a family, perhaps. But it's a good way of sort of seeing where these texts are being spread. And it's a nice, the Morian is a very easy example actually to show that easy connection, because the manuscript is an absolute treasure trove. Some of the others that I look at aren't as
Mm.
easy. They don't have as many interventions from later hands that the manuscript in The Hague does.
It sounds absolutely intriguing. I'm absolutely loving learning all this from you. So thank you.
Oh,
And
you're welcome.
we've touched on some misconceptions, I suppose,
Mm.
about race in the medieval period, and some ideas that you are challenging with your work, which is so important. But just maybe summarize for us what you think in the last sort of couple of years you've been working on your PhD, what you think are some of the greatest misconceptions related to how we think about race in the medieval period that you've come up against or that you've come across.
I think maybe if I do two strands, I think within the academic strand,
Yeah.
it's sort of understanding that race is this, it's in like a matrix, I think is how we're sort of trying to visualize it, is it's many things happening at once, which is vastly different to the modern period. And even in the modern period, it's still very sort of complex, it's very sort of intertwined. But when you talk about race in our age, most people are going to assume you're talking about skin color, and that's sort of a huge issue if you're going into that pre-modern sphere, because again, you will have otherness which is purely based on skin color, but then you'll have otherness which is facilitated perhaps mainly by religion. And I think a key example, I'm not looking at as much, but it is the Jews, because
Hmm.
they are seen in sort of the medieval period. I mean, even now, sadly, people, want to separate sort of Jewish people from our society, and that's not great. In the medieval period, in particular, they are seen as a completely different race, and it's mainly facilitated through religion. It's a complete different religion to Christianity, and you see it in so many texts. In Mandeville's Travels, for example, you see that he envisions that the Jews are in their own land. They're sort of ensconced behind some mountains. That's where they should be, and they have this fear that maybe at the end times they will sort of break out from this sort of enclosed space. But yeah, I think it's mainly that it's so complex, I
Hmm.
think, in this period. But from sort of that non-academic sort of
Yep.
standpoint and wrestling with sort of the paradoxes of what race actually is and means in the medieval period, it is definitely that the Middle Ages isn't white. That's
Yep.
that's the main thing. And I think we really suffer from that myth, especially with the weaponization of the period. I mean, it's the go-to for the far right.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, it's like they gravitate towards it like bees to honey, like a moth to a flame, because of this myth, because they sort of weirdly seek solace in this sort of wrongly formed nostalgia that it was just white, and that's wrong. And that really sort of that myth wrongly informs people
Yeah.
of the Middle Ages, and then it also, it gives foundation to rise to this sort of vehement ideologies, which
Hmm.
then seeks to exclude people in our modern age. So really, it's going back and sort of showing all these examples, and then destabilizing these myths, because we sort of really suffer from. We can see that in my earlier examples I was talking about, people of color in fantasy TV, where there are things
Yeah.
which are myths, and they're not real,
Yeah.
but people take umbrage with the fact that there are black people, but there are literal dragons in the sky, and that comes from the fact that there is that weaponization of anything that's medieval. People assume anything medieval is inherently white,
Right.
and that's
Yeah.
sort of a real issue.
Oh, and that's why your work is so important, Georgie. And I'm so
Yeah,
grateful that you came
I
on to
hope so.
talk to us. Absolutely, it definitely is. And I'm sure that people listening would like to learn
Mm.
more about it and perhaps follow what you're doing. Is there anywhere that they can go online to do that?
Yeah, so I have, sadly, I'm still on X, but it's mainly just to see what other people are doing. But yeah, on X, I'm Georgie Berwick, but it's Berwick, like Berwick upon Tweed. I have an Instagram which is called it's Black Knight Project.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to share more sort of about sort of all sort of things within in my project. Maybe the issues that I come up against within my research, little snippets of research, all that kind of stuff. And I also will share sort of I've got other talks coming up
Yeah.
and things if people sort of are interested. And also I am on BLUESKY, which is sort of a nicer
That's one.
social media. And it's medieval Georgie on BLUESKY. But any of those, people feel free to ask any questions, or they have any help they want with, even with just sort of the romance side of things,
Yeah.
maybe. I'm always happy to talk
Fantastic.
about anything. It doesn't have to be particularly on race.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, fantastic. Well, I'll add some links to our show notes to make it easy for people to find you there. But I can't let you go just yet. There is one more thing I do when I have guests on the show for the first time, and that's what I call 10 to go. So these are just 10 quick questions to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one, because I love visiting historic sites, is what is one of your favorite historic sites to visit?
I think, can I have two?
All right, I'll let you have two.
I think one is because I can see it from my window is Canterbury Cathedral,
Oh,
because that's where I live. So it would be a
beautiful.
shame not to say
Yeah.
Canterbury Cathedral. But a second, I recently went to Florence, and I absolutely
Mm.
love the Duomo in Florence. I think it's and I would be shameful actually. There's going to be a third, but it's within Florence. Dante's house, because I have a tattoo of Dante, so he's right here. It would be a shame not to mention him.
Not to
Yeah,
mention
that's
him.
a
Oh.
fantastic place.
I love that. Love all of those. And because we're all book lovers here on Talking Tudors, what is the last book that you read, or perhaps one you're currently reading?
The last book I read, so I reread it. It was A Clash of Kings, George R. R. Martin, Game of Thrones.
Oh, oh, I love Game of
Yeah,
Thrones, I have to
it's
say.
one of my favorites.
I'm a big
Hmm.
fan. And what about when you're writing and you're researching and you're working? Do you have any rituals that you kind of like to follow?
Not really, no.
No, that's
I'm
okay.
quite easy. I usually I work a lot in cafes, so
I like that.
particularly one of my favorites is there's a shop which specializes in tea, so lots of different teas. So I think it's mainly staying sort of caffeinated and
Yeah,
trying to do
absolutely.
things.
Love it. And what is a last film or maybe series that you watched?
Ooh, I'm currently watching Department Q on
Oh, I
Netflix.
don't know that one. What's that
Yeah,
about?
so it's sort of based, it's an adaptation of a Scandi book series. It's
Okay.
essentially these ragtag police officers.
Mm,
They're made into a unit which solves cold cases. It's
okay.
really good. I've been
Mhm.
trying to work it out and I'm not sure if I'm going to be right, but I've got 2 episodes left, and so I'll
Oh,
see if I'm a little bit like Columbo. I doubt it.
love it. Thank you. And what about a new skill that you might like to learn? Is there anything on your bucket list?
Well, I always like to learn languages. So I'm
Mm,
actually currently learning early modern Dutch. So that is my new skill that
amazing.
and to my detriment, it's as we've been discussing, it's extremely contextual. So that's
Yeah.
always fun trying to learn and translate. But it's been a joy so far.
Oh, wonderful. Yep, that's fantastic. What about a travel destination, maybe apart from Florence, that you might like to visit?
Oh, there are so many.
There are so many. Yeah.
I think staying within the theme of Dutch, I'm due to go to Amsterdam and The Hague, and I've never been before, so
Oh,
that's on
oh,
that's on
it's
my
so
list.
wonderful. You'll absolutely love that. And what about your favorite season and why?
I think I don't know if I have a favorite season. Oh, maybe autumn. Autumn because it's cozy and I love jumpers and knitted things. So when it
Yes,
slowly tracks
definitely.
towards winter and I can pull a jumper out, I'm always happy.
Yeah, me too. That's my favorite season.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And when you were a child, what did you hope to become when you were older?
Well, I thought at one point I might be an Olympic athlete because I was projected to go to the Olympics. I did high jump as a
Oh,
child.
wow.
So
That's cool.
basically not what I do now. I had
No
no
way.
idea that I had no idea that I'd still be studying. I always liked studying, but I
Yeah.
didn't think that was ever on my dreams board as a
Yeah.
child.
Yeah. And what do you like to do to relax and unwind? You're obviously very busy doing a lot.
Reading. I
Yeah.
love to read, actually. A lot of my friends are really surprised because you read a lot doing a PhD, that I still read for fun, but I love to read. So that's what I'm always doing. I finish work and pick up my book.
Love it. Absolutely love it. And the last question is for a takeaway. So it's normally a Tudor takeaway, but this can be a medieval takeaway, and it's something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
I think sticking with, I mentioned it earlier, Miranda Kaufmann's The Black Tudors. It's
Yes.
one of sort of the best pieces of non-fiction out there, especially for anyone who's interested in learning more about sort of the history, the Black history of Britain pre sort of slave trade, and to add to that, the John Blanke project, which
Yes.
again is another project which is seeking to unveil the lives of Black Tudors, and so they have a nice little website where you can look at all the work that they've been doing, and they will then point you off to sort of different things that you can get your teeth stuck into. But I'd recommend those for anyone interested in this sort of area.
Absolutely fantastic takeaways, and I'll add links to those as well. And Georgie, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the
Oh,
podcast
thank
and
you.
speak with me.
Thank you. It's been an absolute joy. It's been a really real joy.